All right. Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, whatever it is you might be watching us from. Um, Welcome to Gathering in Quarantine or Tertuliando en Cuarentena in good Spanish. Tonight, today, Monday. I always got to look at my calendar. 28th of September. We're almost on that curb hitting October. And it seems so bizarre to me. So bizarre to me at times. To me, I want to accentuate that. Feels like time has stopped, but at the same time has rolled by. It's so very strange. So any of you who've never partaken, I don't know how to properly conjugate that, of this space is a space of intentional accidentality and accidental intentionality in terms of the conversations that we navigate and how I try to navigate these conversations is honestly and with as much transparency as I can, and I bring people who I feel have have a life journey that is worth talking about, and they're open to share and what they've been venturing through their pilgrimage, and so far throughout these 6 months I've really come to enjoy this. And so tonight I'm actually going to be talking to a person who's actually related with the shirt I'm wearing. And I think it was particularly the reason I added her on Facebook. I can't remember. I don't know, my memory's failing me, or if I'm constructing a myth, if that's how I met. But I think it was that. And I think that got my attention. And we had some friends in common. And so she designed this shirt, Listen to Kids. And I, as a pedagogist or a teacher, I value that immensely. So it really caught my attention. So I guess the luring message of the shirt got us to kind of meet. So without any further ado, to not stretch out this introduction any longer, let me bring over Anna Skates, joining us straight from Tennessee.
Hi.
Hola, welcome.
Hi. Thank you for having me, man.
Thank you so much for
Yeah, of
accepting, which I
course.
always value very much because it's kind of like accepting an invitation a bit to the unknown. And there is
Hmm.
magic in the unknown, but there's also a sense of what did I just do,
No, I'm glad to be here. This is great.
Vale, vale. So thank you so much. And I like to start things off talking about our current context, our current context in this time of pandemia, in this time of, like I was mentioning in the beginning, it just, at least to me, and I really like to emphasize it's just me because I don't want to take my experience and impose it on everyone else, but it just seems weird. Time just seems very weird, very
Hmm.
weird. There's an element of privilege that goes into that too. I can, I don't have the same issues as other people, but at least for me, it has been a very weird time. And I like starting things up, starting our conversations, talking about the present context and how the
Yeah.
present context has been navigated by you. And I do that through this question of three branched questions. So there's a
Okay.
question of three parts. And first part is, the beginning of the year, 2020 comes in. Some people, as they transition to 2020, they're already smelling that this year was, it was almost like all these little spoiler alerts that it was going to be very rigid and very harsh. I
Hmm.
don't know if that was for you. So January, February, kind of like, what were you doing? Second part of the question is, the quarantine hits, the pandemic hits, the coronavirus is out in this western part of the world, and all these different approaches, governmentally speaking, are done. So it hits you. So you were doing something, it hits you, and how has it been for these 6 months?
Yes.
And then the third and last part of the question, I would like to get some sort of observations from you as to maybe things that you've noticed that the pandemic has brought out in terms of society.
Yes. Okay. I think I can do that. So, January and February, I was living in Los Angeles. I had moved to Los Angeles last summer, last June, and was so excited about it. I love LA. I feel like I belong in LA for so many reasons. Felt like home. things were great. I was still traveling a lot though, so I wasn't there a ton. I was there, 4 days a week on average, and then I was traveling the rest of the week. But that was great. And in February, I flew here to Tennessee for a business meeting, and then everything hit, and I have not been back to LA since. So it's been an interesting journey for me personally with that part, just because I'm hyper independent. I'm a very independent person, and I pride myself on that, probably to a fault. Um, and I was really having a hard time for a while giving up the idea that LA is a reality right now. I had to come to terms with the fact that it's okay that this is not happening right now, even though this is what you wanted for your life and this is where you wanted to be. So that's been an adjustment for me. That's probably been my biggest adjustment, honestly. But frankly, timing wise and just practically speaking, it couldn't have turned out any better. I'm right where I need to be, and I know that. I feel that. Um, so I was in between apartments anyway in LA, and there was no way I would be able to afford to live in LA right now. so, so it really did work out great, and that's been nice. And then, as far as culturally speaking, or what I've observed about society, I observed it through how I recognized my own feelings about what was happening. So I found myself being more productive than I have ever been,
Hmm.
probably in my life. As a freelance, like self-employed person, um, my personality type is one that has a bit of difficulty mustering up the energy to get things done. so, um, so what was interesting about all of this is everything shut down, and it's almost as if I was able to catch up with the pace of the world. Because the world slowed down, I was able to then
Hmm.
catch up and start producing, not in an unhealthy way, but I was just able to kind of lift myself up because I didn't feel constantly behind anymore, because the whole world had slowed down. So, or at least my whole world, this country, had
Hmm.
slowed down. So that was a great benefit to me, and also something that I observed. Obviously, we talk about the fast pace of the world all the time. Um, it's a common whatever thing that people talk about, but I had never really noticed it or felt it until it stopped, and I was able to catch up and realize, like, wow, I live behind the ball. Like, I live behind always, because our world moves so fast. So anyway, that's been an interesting observation for me, and seeing how people cope with a slower pace. Some love it, and some are just, it drives them absolutely crazy.
Yeah.
So it's just been interesting to watch. But I've deeply appreciated the slower pace. It's picking up, it feels, but I've deeply appreciated that.
So for you, it comes out quite naturally to be in that realm of embracing a I guess it's not even a gradual slowing down, but a very sudden slowing down.
Hmm.
So for you navigating that,
Hmm.
that's felt like more instinctive, like for you.
Yeah, it was strange. It's like I didn't even know it was happening until I recognized how much I was working and how hard I was going at things. Like, that was the only time I recognized. I didn't even, obviously, from a practical level, like, I couldn't exactly like fly back to LA and get my stuff.
Yeah,
There were
yeah,
practical things that made the halt obvious, but yeah, for me it was, I ended up noticing internally what was happening with me, and that's when I looked around and realized, like, oh, everything has stopped, and it was kind of nice.
so what I'm trying to get into perspective is like your modus operandi, or like your mode of how you work, was a
Mhm.
bit of a fast paced type of dynamic pre this this time, or it was I mean, or was it just faster than what it is now, but still slower than the normal average go 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 rush 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 of the dynamics of society. Like like was your regular normal, was it still like somewhat a bit of a contrast to?
Yeah, yeah. So my normal is things are moving fast, but I often feel like I have a hard time keeping up. So
But
even
do you
though,
want to? Do you?
well, yes and no. I mean, there's so many things I want to do and make
Mm,
and create and put out there in the world, but it almost felt like I was having to work so hard to keep up with the energy level of the rest of the world moving so fast that I didn't have the energy then to go and actually do the things and make the things that I wanted to do and
yeah,
make, if that makes sense. So
yeah, it does.
my internal pace was much slower than, than the external world, I think. And I didn't have energy for both. And um, so yeah, when the world slowed down, I got to sort of catch my breath and actually focus in on the things I really loved doing and wanted to be doing. So it was really nice.
So in this space of non-negotiable transition, which you kind of have to find yourself in, especially
Yep.
in your case, very observable as you couldn't just fly back, because all the lockdown. What if we had to sum up or kind of come come with a takeaway of what you have perhaps evolved, yeah, I like this, and evolved into,
Mm-hmm.
and during the last 6, now going to 7 months, like what is your observable takeaway of how you have evolved as a person in a conscientious
Oh,
way
I
that you
like
can
it.
you can that you can see it and you can point to it.
Yeah. I think the the main takeaway for me was um, always write your plans in pencil. Nothing is permanent. You can make plans all day long for your life and what you want to be doing, and something's going to happen and it's going to have to shift and you're going to have to be okay with it. So, flexibility and plans, because I love a list and I love a good plan.
Yeah.
And I get so frustrated when that plan doesn't happen the way that I thought that it was going to happen. So,
Ah,
that's a big takeaway for me and something I've had to grow into and out of that mindset of no, this is the way it was supposed to be, and now I'm mad about it. I just chose to stop being mad about it and say, you know what, plans change, and that's okay. So that's my biggest takeaway is just stay flexible.
so basically be able to plan for the unplanned.
Exactly. Exactly.
I think I mean when I get on that mode, which is very rare because I'm kind of like, ooh, just loosey goosey in some things, although
Yeah.
sometimes the OCD kicks in, and then I go into that sort of like militant organizing mode.
All right.
But I have experienced some friends that are a little bit more like that,
Mm-hmm.
and a little bit of that. I could definitely use a little bit of that, in some
Right.
perspective. But this space of being in lockdown, yes, like being able to do these things, and like I was telling you before, the art of punctuality. I've been actually trying to master it. So this has been quite an observer. And the thing is, that I do it very willingly because I don't answer to anyone. I mean, there's no sponsors here. There's like I can just start whenever I want.
Yep.
But I felt, what, I wrote there certain time, so I'm going to try start at that certain time unless there's
Yeah.
something out of my reach, and that's fine. But I think that's a little bit of a little checklist I can check out, during these last 6, 7 months, like that punctuality
Yeah.
endeavor. I have learned to permanently tattoo it in my head and be like, this is actually something nice.
It's
It's,
really it's
it's a
a
good
practice and
predictable thing.
discipline. Yeah, yeah, for sure.
So another thing I like to do here is to allow my guests to share a little bit about themselves,
Hmm.
and I do it via this question about changes and about experiences of transformation throughout your
Hmm.
life. So if you can think or you can pinpoint to moments, instances, it could be seasons, but just memories that come to your head when you think about
Hmm.
cathartic moments, moments that you feel were significant enough to form the person that you are today. So if you can share three moments throughout your life that you
3 moments.
feel were, man, like that really had to do with where I'm at now. It could be
Yeah.
as far back as
Childhood.
born,
Yeah,
yeah,
sure.
and as recently as a few hours ago. It's like all
Hmm.
inclusive.
Okay. Um, well, I think I would say, I think the first would be, these are like later in life moments, but I'm sure there are earlier ones. But off the cuff, I would say the first was, I worked for 4.5 years as a children's pastor at a progressive uh, Christian church here in Tennessee. Um, and that job quite literally sort of fell into my lap. I was approached to apply for the job because I had volunteered in the nursery. It was the most random thing,
It
but
is.
it was really perfect.
No.
For whatever reason, the lead pastor at the time just saw something and was like, "I
Yeah.
think you really should try for this. I think it'd be great." And it, while I'm not necessarily in the church world anymore, that job was so incredibly, it wasn't a job. I mean, it was such a perfect fit for me. And I think in so many ways it gave me space um, to find my own voice, and I got a lot of just practical, like, practice doing things. So I wrote, 2 years worth of curriculum for kids ages 3 up to 10 or 11. um
During that
a,
time.
During that time, yeah, and it was a different lesson each week for each age group. So I got a lot of writing practice, a lot of practical, like, lesson writing practice. I got a lot of time with kids, which is just the most invaluable thing to me. Um, and I got to feel, it was really interesting. I was in a leadership position really for the first time in my life. I was in charge of an entire like ministry, so to speak, and that I had never been in that position. And so I was forced to see myself as a leader, which I had never really seen myself as before. So for a lot of the practice reasons, and then for a lot of the internal reasons, that that moment and that period of time was incredibly significant for me. The second moment, I think, was probably me choosing to leave my 6 year marriage. That was a biggie. It was obviously it was me initiating conflict, which is real tough for me. But
Mm.
so it was a moment where I knew what I had to do, and I had to be okay with this thing that I feared the most, which was conflict and causing someone else pain.
Yeah.
Um, and it was one of the best decisions I've ever made for myself. And it was an incredibly empowering moment, even though also very sad and very difficult, for all the reasons. But I remember my therapist at the time. I went into my therapy session and I said, "Hey, this is what's happening." Like, I told him, and we're like working on the papers and stuff. And she just looked at me and she said, Anna, I'm so glad that you stopped shrinking down to size. I'm so glad you decided to stop shrinking down to size." And so that that probably more than anything else, at least in the last, 10 years, was one of the most transformative moments of my life. Hearing that and recognizing, like, wow, I actually, like we were talking about earlier, it's okay for me to take up space in my own life.
Mm.
It's okay for me to take up space and create the life that I want, rather than just doing these things that I think I'm supposed to do because
Yeah.
society tells me I'm supposed to do it. So, um, incredibly transformative moment. And then I would say more recently, a couple of years ago, my sort of journey and pilgrimage to Pittsburgh, seeing the "Won't You Be My Neighbor" documentary about Fred Rogers a few years ago. Um, that, yep, that one. I don't. We can get more into that, but that, for a lot of reasons, was one of the single most important moments of my entire life.
Vale, vale. And we will talk a little bit more expansively on that.
Yeah.
And I really appreciate you, sharing that part, the second one as well.
Yeah.
I think that's clearly not something you had to share. And
Sure.
so I do really appreciate that you feel comfortable to share that and to basically exhibit or be open about the fact that life in in its realm of its pilgrimages and its journeys, um, it's not exactly a contest of how can you match this as best as possible to the expectation that everyone else has on you.
Right.
And when you were mentioning, like, because you're not conflictive, and we are talking before about the enneagram,
Mm-hmm.
and I can understand even more. We
Yeah.
had that talk before, and I can understand that too. I was in a relationship with a person that was kind of like the non-conflictive,
Mm-hmm.
and through her, I was able to understand a little bit of what it is to kind of go with the motion of things,
Yeah.
and then things kind of become piled up and piled up and piled up, and then one day,
You
volcano.
explode. Yep.
And as the
Absolutely.
recipient of that lava
Yes.
which is real lava, it's real lava
Mm-hmm.
in the sense of some
Yeah.
legitimate things. So
Sure.
that was to me a lesson, also the importance of being able to talk, therapy, or just having
Yeah.
space and friends, and just realizing sometimes that we made decisions, and that decision leads us to a certain place, and that's life. That's the
I was gonna say that's
pedagogical
life,
lesson.
baby.
You learn and you unlearn,
Yeah.
and that's kind of how it goes. It's not a formula. It's not, hey, get
Nope.
married so you can get divorced, or don't get divorced so you can get married. There's no formula. You just
No.
it is what it is in certain cases, and we have the luxury or the privilege that sometimes we grab onto the lesson or the lessons, and I think that's
Yeah.
phenomenal. So thank you for sharing that.
Of course.
Throughout this conversation, we're definitely going to be talking about Fred Rogers and what
Mm-hmm.
Fred Rogers means to you, what he means to me. But you were sharing a little bit about what your I guess experience has been with children, and that
Mm-hmm.
in that realm of teaching, experiencing life with them, creating lessons.
Yeah.
Um, was that you said prior to that you work in a nursery in that church.
Yeah.
So was there anything prior to that was connecting you to that realm of being in connection with children? What was your first interaction in a concrete way to that realm, and maybe what motivated you, what drew you to this is really something I feel I'm driven to do.
Yeah. Yeah. So lots preceded that church job and the nursery volunteer situation. So I grew up babysitting my little cousins, which I always loved and like very quickly volunteered myself to do. I've loved working with kids for as long as I can remember. So that goes way back. And there's no moment necessarily that made it click. I've just always been very drawn to it. I always sought out opportunities to volunteer in my community or in my church growing up, ways to connect with younger kids. And then um, after after college, I worked as a preschool teacher for a little while. I worked as a children's librarian for a little while, and then moved into this children's pastor role, and then to where we are today. But yeah, oh, it's been there for a very very long time. I absolutely adore working with kids. I always say kids are my people. That if I get to choose a group of people to do the rest of my life with, it's going to be a group of like 5 year olds. They're just my favorite humans on the
I'm there
planet.
with
So
you.
yeah, yeah,
I'm definitely there with you.
yep.
I always say that out of my last experience working in school, I had a blast working with kids. It was the adults that I wasn't too keen.
Yes.
And it's not even like playful rhetoric. I'm so serious. I mean, it was so serious. Like it was always highly problematic because I was problematizing some things. And as we were
Yeah,
talking
sure.
before, I am that person in that Enneagram that creates conflict, especially when I
Hmm.
see that things are not working as they should, or as I see that
Yeah.
there's clearly some things that are motivating they're motivating injustice or motivating the status quo to be okay, and I have a hardly problem with that.
Yeah.
I definitely am hands down working with kids is
It's the
a no
best.
brainer for me.
Yeah.
It's
Yep.
just
It just also means working with parents, which I love, and that's been a challenge for me because I'm not a parent. So it's a fine line that I walk in a lot of my work, but yeah, working with kids absolutely means working with parents. So you have to be ready for that for sure. But it's good
yes,
work.
yes, and that leaves a lot of space for learning too. What is it
Yeah,
like to
yeah.
be a parent, and also maybe creating influence back and forth. You
Yeah.
know, Paulo Freire said, in the act of teaching I learn, and in the act of learning I teach.
It's so
So
good.
that's always a two-way street.
Yes.
You mentioned being in church, and you mentioned how now that's not necessarily a part of your regular everyday life.
Hmm.
Tell us maybe a little bit about that. Is that in some way connected with your experiences as being a pastor? How did that kind of like I know you kind of mentioned that you were brought up in the church.
Hmm.
How has that evolution, or how has that journey kind of, as however you want to lay it out,
Sure.
how has it evolved? Where were you? Where are you now?
Yeah. Yeah. So I grew up in the southern United States. So I grew up in Alabama. So I grew up in the Southern Baptist denomination, pretty conservative, very community oriented. I loved my upbringing. I didn't. There's so many people who have such an unfortunate history and past with the church. And it was very hurtful and very damaging. For me, I was one of the lucky ones that didn't necessarily internalize all those things in that way. And I wasn't necessarily hurt or jaded by the church. Um, as I got older, I was very, very involved growing up, very involved in church growing up. So, started our youth praise band and was part of the drama teams and all that. I mean, I was in everything I could be. My mom played piano and my dad was a deacon every year of my life that I can remember. So we were very, very involved. And then in college, I went to college here in Nashville, and I went to college for music. I thought I was going to be a contemporary Christian music artist. That's what I wanted to be. And so I came here with those aspirations. And then halfway through, at the end of my sophomore year, decided I don't think that the music business itself is for me at all. I'm not interested in playing that game at all. So I switched my major halfway through college to study religion. And it was a religion in the arts program, which was really lovely. And it was a perfect fit for me at the time. And so got to study a little more from an academic perspective, my faith. And some things got unraveled in that process. Um, it's that I don't know if you've ever heard of this image of you start pulling on the thread of a sweater, and
Oh,
before you know it, the entire sweater's gone.
unending.
So
Yeah.
yeah, so it was a little bit of that, except it was a nice experience because I was also studying and learning new things at the same time. So these old thoughts were being replaced by new thoughts, which was really, really, really helpful. And some old thoughts were being supported by new information that I was
Mm-hmm.
getting. So that was a really great experience, but certainly some things started to sort of break apart for me there. Then, and I met my ex husband in college. He ended up going to Yale Divinity School. And I watched his faith completely explode in a bad, like completely fall apart
Yeah.
there. Learned a lot of things from him through that. I sort of, I was the listening ear of a lot of thoughts and study and working out papers and ideas for those. And so I learned a lot more there, and a lot more things started to unravel and get replaced by new ideas that just made more sense. When I say replaced, it's not that I was like, oh, that's old news and I want this new
Yeah.
stuff. It was more just, this makes a lot more sense. Like
Yeah.
this new idea, I can understand this actually, this fits with my experience of the world,
Yeah.
my
Yeah.
experience of people. Um, and then we moved back to Nashville after he graduated and we got married, moved back to Nashville, and then tried a bunch of different churches, and we couldn't do it. We couldn't hang with a lot of the southern churches
What
here.
was the experience? I mean, what were you perhaps expecting or looking for that, once you were there, you're like, what is going on? I don't.
Yeah, I mean there was a deep desire, at least for me, to still be part of the local church. I desperately wanted to be part of a community and a local church, but most of the churches that we visited, including ones that we had gone to when we were in college, in undergrad, were still very much working out of those old thoughts that we had long kind of left behind. And so it was very difficult
Any
to
any any
find anything
any,
to
per,
grab onto.
any particular ones like that you might remember, like that I see kind of like the image of dominoes falling, and one
Right.
falling and then the other one. Was there any particular domino that was probably like that big one, and then everything? Like for me, it was the LGBT issue.
Hmm.
That definitely knocked in, and I experienced that when I was at Hillsong College. I was in Australia,
Oh,
so that was a
wow. I didn't know
big
that.
domino to
Yeah,
fall
yeah,
down
yeah,
over
yeah.
there.
I honestly think that was it for me as well. I know that it is because I took a course at Belmont called Christian Ethics,
Mm,
and life-changing course for me because we had a group project where we had to create an argument for and against a particular like hot button issue, and my group got LGBTQ rights for
mm.
marriage.
Ooh.
Gay marriage is what it was.
You remember what year
What we did.
this was in?
This would have been 2007 ish.
Okay, so yeah, this was definitely way before the Supreme Court decision.
Yeah,
Like,
yeah, yeah.
like at least six,
Um,
7 years before.
yeah. And so through the work of researching for that project, that was a big domino for me that fell. And of course, the majority of the churches that we visited later on, when we tried again to rejoin that world, were not affirming like at all. And so we landed at this church that at the time didn't consider itself a progressive church, but we showed up and we sort of we heard a subliminal message that wasn't outright. The pastor wasn't outright saying things, but it was there, and we were like,
What was it?
so I
If you
can't
remember it.
remember what. Oh, I think there was one particular message I remember where he was saying, if you come to church, if you come into this space and you do not feel good, like something about this is not okay for you, whether it's past trauma or something that's being said or a belief that's being held, he was like, stay home. You don't have to be here. Like, we want you here, but goodness gracious, like, you shouldn't have to hurt yourself to be here.
Yeah,
And it was like, you can't say that. You can't,
yeah.
he can't say that.
Bad
Like,
marketing.
but yeah, I was like, his salary depends on them being here. What is he talking about? So there were little moments like that,
Oh,
um, where we
I can
heard
see that.
things. Yeah, we heard these subliminal messages, and we are like, we could stick around for this, and we
And it was
did.
a
And
non-denominational church,
it's a non-denominational church, yeah. And so we stuck around, and then I ended up on staff,
and that's where
like a year
yeah,
later. Yeah,
that's interesting. And that's where
yeah.
you ended up. How long
Hmm.
were you there for?
We attended. I was there for 5.5 years, and I was
Okay,
on staff for 4.5.
it's a good amount of time. It's a
Yeah.
definitely good amount of time. Did you lose your last feathers of quote unquote faith whilst in there? And I don't want to put words in your mouth. I don't want to say like you lost your faith, but did
Yeah,
you
yeah.
whatever brought you out of that church world which you were not
Mhm.
a part of now as
Mhm.
you were?
Mhm.
Did it happen there? Was that like the final?
Yeah, and when I say I'm not part of the church world, I just mean I don't attend anywhere necessarily. I still have a deep respect for the work of the church, and I think there are so many people who need the the redeeming work of the progressive church that's desperately trying to reframe things for people so that it's a safer place for everyone. Um, I just don't. take part in anymore. But yeah, I think there, interestingly enough, the same process that was happening for me in college sort of continued at that church because we were, and it happened for us collectively as a staff. We were all starting to sort of pick apart these beliefs and these old ideas that were still hanging out, you know,
Yeah.
in our psyche and in our doctrine. And we started sort of picking those things apart and finding new and for us better ideas that were more welcoming to all people, safer for all people, et cetera, et cetera. Um, and we got to a point as a staff where we were saying, is it okay that we still call ourselves a Christian church? Because we're towing the line here.
Wow. I mean,
Like
that's a
it
big
was,
thing.
yeah. So I think for a lot of us, things continue to unravel there. And then I stopped working there and then never jumped back into that world basically.
Mm.
So, but like I said, I deeply appreciate it. And I know a lot of good people that are still in that space and working really hard, doing a lot of restorative work, for people. And it's so desperately needed. So,
And I think it's very valuable to make those observations to, you know, to know where one's, where one stands, and
mm-hmm.
also maybe also recognize the, the pedagogical value that that experience had for you
Yeah.
to be where you find yourself at, and in a very direct way, because I mean, what I hear from that experience is that they were, I mean, they were channeling quite candidly and quite openly some of these very real, perhaps theological things that they were maybe wrestling with, and they were
Mm-hmm.
just bringing it out forth.
Yep.
I think that's fascinating. I wish I had experiences like that in the
Yeah.
church, but it wasn't the extreme opposite. But it wasn't. It was more like, oh, so you're having these questions. Here's a little prayer
Oh, yeah.
recipe.
Right.
You gotta,
Let's
you
quiet that
gotta more
question.
intensely dive
Yeah.
into it. Have you tried fasting 2.5 hours a day?
Oh God, right.
Um, the recipe faith.
Right, right, yes.
But later on, you start, like I would, like you were sharing, like as you start kind of, reading, experiencing, engaging. For me,
Mhm.
was one of my first ones was after I went to Australia. I came back. I ended up going to my good friend Jay Baker's church in Brooklyn, and
Mhm.
they basically had a church meeting in a bar. I mean, that definitely was a bit of a
Sure.
bit of a domino fall for me. It wasn't a crazy idea, but just to partake in it. I remember meeting someone who was transitioning, gender
Mhm.
transitioning, and it was a life changing moment. Meeting
Yeah.
him, and experiencing that,
Yeah.
when I mean that, all the experiences that he had
Yeah.
were
Yep.
heavy, 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 heavy. So all the black and whites that I had were just
Yep.
not so black and white anymore.
Yep.
Yeah, it doesn't make a lot of sense. So,
No, it makes perfect sense.
in this space of evolution, which I think, and that's what I love about this in these tertulias, there's so many different stories that are so similar and yet so different,
Mhm.
that testify to the evolution of life. And now in the climate that we live in, that there is so much being preached or taught or imposed, that that militancy is celebrated, like the fact that you stand against evolution, and I don't mean to make a pun on that, but stand against evolving and growing. It seems like something to be applauded. The other
Mhm.
day, and this is the last thing I want to talk about this. Well, last thing I'm going to say about this, but the other day I was watching this prayer event that
Mhm.
I think Franklin Graham was doing, and I was watching that, and I saw. I mean, it's been a while since I've exposed myself freely to that type of dynamic.
Mhm.
I kind of taken myself a little bit out of the masochism realm, but at least for me. But I noticed that there's the rhetoric of the militaristic rhetoric, the invading rhetoric, and then how prayer just makes it all good. We're praying for our
Mm.
soldiers, we're
Right.
praying for the okay. Of course, we want everyone to be okay, but it's so one sided.
Right.
It's so one sided. What about Vietnam? What about Iraq? What about all Latin
Right.
American countries? And I'm like, it doesn't. And then here, and most of the people I saw there were just mainly the most amount of people are white. That
Mhm.
also gives you a bit of a hint.
Mhm.
But that is the climate we're in.
Yeah.
I want to get to that. That is the climate we're in.
Yeah.
So for you, for me, for other people, we might not be part of the majority that are questioning and embracing things.
Mhm.
And I want to jump now into the pedagogical realm of Fred Rogers, which is
Yeah.
something I'm really excited to talk about with
Yeah.
you. How did you were you when you were a kid? Did you ever remember watching PBS or seeing Miss Rogers?
Yeah, I mean, I grew up watching it, not like religiously or anything. I mean, I didn't watch it a whole lot, but I certainly there were when I watched it later in life. You know how there are things you taste something or you hear something or you smell something and it brings back a really vivid memory. So there were things like that, like the bell of the trolley. When I heard it
Hmm.
later in life, I was like, oh my gosh, yes, I very vividly remember sitting in my
Yes.
living room watching this. So yes, I grew up watching it, but it wasn't like my favorite show of all time, and I certainly didn't understand just how important that show was or the depth of it then by any means. But
When
um,
did you come to that realization?
when I saw, so the Won't You Be My Neighbor documentary came out, it was the first documentary about Fred Rogers, um, who I will probably call Fred for the rest of this conversation because he's my friend. Um,
I
but
love that.
so when that documentary came out a few years ago, I saw it a few days after it came out, and
You went to the cinema.
I went to the cinema and to a little independent theater here in Nashville. And um, before the credits even started rolling on the movie, I was crying. The credits are at the beginning of the movie. So
I
I'm
can a little
crying.
bit relate with that.
Yeah. So he, but he talks at the very beginning, this is what made me cry. It's an old interview. He's at his piano in his living room and he's talking about chord progressions, which I understand as a musician.
Hmm.
And he was saying there are some transitions between chords and some progressions that are pretty simple and pretty basic. He said, but then there are some transitions that are really difficult, and you have to navigate between and on the black keys, or you have to stretch your fingers out a little more, and it's a little more difficult to make that transition. And he said for children, there are some transitions in life that are just a little more difficult than others. And I feel that it's my job to help them navigate those transitions and to help them move through those transitions in the best way I can. They just need someone there to help them transition through life. And there are so many transitions in childhood. And I'm just sobbing in the theater. Um, and that's what he did on his show. And he, of course, had a religious background as well. And this was his ministry. He was ordained in the Presbyterian Church as a
Hmm.
minister to television. Like that was his official ordination from the Presbyterian
Yeah, it
Church,
was a
which
new
was
thing.
unheard of. Yeah. And he certainly felt, I think, that his work, it was a combination of his sort of ministerial heart, this pastoral sort of shepherding heart, and also his deep knowledge of developmental psychology. Like he knew from an academic
Yeah.
perspective what childhood was and what development was, and so he married those two things together, and that's what that show was. And it is evident now as an adult who is the same. I have this deep love of spending time with children and teaching children and being around children, and also spend all of my free time reading like early child development and parenting books. That's all I do. And so he wove that into every piece of his show, like
Hmm.
down to, from the structure to the words that he used to the images that he presented to the kids, the way he spoke with his guests, and just literally everything about it was so deeply intentional and so deeply rooted in this dual person of pastor and developmental psychologist. And it
Yeah.
was brilliant,
and
absolutely
and and,
brilliant.
and I think more importantly, maybe and friend, like he
Yeah.
was. This the stories I heard. I don't have any memories of when I was a kid. I don't think maybe in Puerto Rico it could have maybe played in some public,
Hmm.
but I don't have any real memory. Maybe when I lived it as a kid, 8, 9 years old in the U.S., and
Hmm.
maybe I have some there, so maybe archived in the back of my subconsciousness. I maybe have some time where he popped up, but it was similar to you, but it was a little bit before the documentary came out.
Okay.
When I was living in Germany, and I was able to still watch the U.S. Netflix over there,
Hmm.
and with my former partner, I discovered that there had a few episodes of the Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood,
Yeah.
and I started watching, and I became hooked
Hmm.
immediately,
Hmm.
and my former partner, even like she also did,
Hmm.
and she never heard of him.
Yeah.
She's over there in Germany. That wasn't a thing, and then I would finish an episode, and then I'll get to another one, and it was everything from the introduction, taking off of the shoes, putting on the sweater,
Hmm.
going on to the land of make believe, and even the simplicity and the the rusticness of the
Yes.
puppets, that
Yes.
all that, it was
Yes.
I didn't get lost in the technicalities of 60s, 70s, or 80s, and
Yeah.
lack of sophistication. There was such something, and then when he would just talk to everyone in the same
Hmm.
way,
Hmm.
I'm like, there is something here. And I just literally finished my teaching degree, and I'm like, there's something here.
Yeah.
And I just kept on watching. You saw the documentary, and that
Hmm.
was a weeping fest
Yep.
in itself. It was a bit for me. I went to see my brother.
Yeah.
We drove to Dallas. I think we drove a long way. We drove a bit of a
Yeah.
long way from Houston. I was here that summer, or whenever it was it came out. And it was like, for me, crying
Yep.
sometimes.
Yep.
Just his level of just how he was tuned into things and
Yes.
listening. And another thing I wanted to mention, when you mentioned that he was an ordained minister,
Hmm.
he never talked about God in his program. And I
No.
love that, because
Hmm. He didn't need to.
exactamente,
He just
exactly.
represented that sort of heavenly love, whatever you want to call it. He just embodied it, and that's enough. To me, that was enough, especially in a program like that.
And also, did you so you got to see the documentary.
Hmm.
Before that, had you been kind of popping in episodes and submerging yourself in, like resubmerging yourself before, or was that the cold turkey going into the documentary?
Yeah, that was it. The documentary was the trigger for me, of everything. For me, um, it was really lovely to see and hear all about Fred's life. But what was so profound for me, and the reason why it was probably the single most important moment of my life in the last few years, was, um, I had been in this world of working with kids for many, many years, and always felt this really deep, responsibility to them as people, to children as people. And it started with, writing lessons at the church. Like, how do I communicate these big, big ideas about God in a way that is actually helpful for these kids, and that makes sense for them? How do I speak their language? How do I not just say the things I know to say, but say it for them, actually write it for them? And it caused me to have to drill down to what I really believed about things, and that was difficult. But anyway, I took a lot of care in that work, and I often felt as though nobody around me quite understood why I cared so much about how I said this to kids. It seemed that the general consensus was, kids are never going to remember this anyway, or kids are resilient, and if you say something wrong or hurtful, like, they'll get over it. All these things, right? This dismissal of taking the time to really truly respect and care for kids in a way that causes you to think about what you're truly saying and how you're saying it. And so, I never quite felt like that was understood by most people, that I was surrounded by. And then, in the middle of this theater in Nashville, Tennessee, I finally see somebody who understands me.
Hmm.
And not only who understands me, but the way that I put it is I felt like I was watching my life being lived out in another body in another time. Like, sorry, this is what happens when I talk
Yeah,
about.
yeah. Like,
um,
that's okay in the space.
yeah. So it was incredibly profound. And I thought, I walked out of the theater. It was so funny. I walked out and I was like intentionally walking slower. I was like, I'm going to walk like Fred and I'm going to like breathe like Fred and I'm going to embrace silence like Fred. Like I was trying everything I could to just soak all of that in. But um, I really felt leaving the theater, I know exactly what I'm supposed to do with my life. And that's it. Not necessarily create a television show per
Hmm.
se, but that thing, that intentionality behind creating content for kids that is for them, that also simultaneously models for parents, like here's how, here's maybe how you can address this issue, or here's maybe
Yeah.
how you could talk to your child about this, if they're having a hard time or whatever. um, it was this beautiful simultaneous model, and and I knew that was my work to do. Like that is mine to do. And so I've spent the last couple of years like drilling down and figuring out what that practically looks like, and I'm still figuring that out. But
When
yeah,
you came out of that movie theater, and yeah, you even mentioned to the specific detail of like trying to slow down.
yeah,
Um, what was it? So it's, documentary came out probably, I think it was 18,
yeah, early
2018.
18. Uh-huh.
But I can relate so much with that. Maybe not to the realm of as soon as I came out of the movie theater, but
Yeah.
working with kids, I tried to slow down.
Hmm.
And that happened for me, and also that happened for me in a time where many things were changing. Like post breakup of a relationship of 6 years, being here during the
Mm.
Christmas break was a lot of time of reflection. And I think it was post, not necessarily documentary. I think it was post the Tom Hanks movie. I think
Uh-huh.
it brought upon that reflection again for me.
Yeah.
And then I came into a new semester in school, and then I started applying these new methods or these
Hmm.
new approaches. And then for some of the kids that I dealt with, I was actually working with special ed students. Some of these kids with ADD that I could definitely relate with in some sense, kindergarten, first graders. And I was trying to slow down, and I would tell the
Mm.
little one, hey, someone will be flustered with his work because he didn't do it how he was supposed to do. And then he was so emphatic on finishing, regardless of whether he finished it correctly or not. He just wanted to get it over and done with because it's so, there's such a system that is so work oriented and so finishing
Yeah.
oriented.
Yeah.
And here's a little 5-year-old kid that I'm telling him, hey, little one, let's just let's take a little break, buddy.
Hmm.
I would just take my hand and slide the paper away from him, and then he would start gnashing his teeth
Hmm.
and closing his fist really hard because he felt,
Mm.
I'm gonna get in trouble. I didn't finish my
Yeah.
work. And
Yeah.
in those moments, I was trying to be like, hey man, like it's okay. Like what we're trying to do here, one, we're trying to get this done, but we
Mm.
want to enjoy it. We want to
Yeah.
have fun.
Yeah.
But that ended up getting me in trouble.
Oh,
That ended up getting me in trouble because teachers were thinking I wasn't doing my work. I
right.
actually had the principal tell me that teachers are complaining that I'm not doing my work, and I'm like, I'm trying these new things, and I would even mention the whole Mr. Rogers thing.
Yeah.
I go to specific detail, and then the response was, "We don't pay you to psychoanalyze kids." And at that moment, I saw the conversation going anywhere else but
Yeah.
like to any sense of truth.
Yeah.
So I was really trying,
Mm.
and I did until they eventually fired me. But I really, and that also helped me
Yeah.
because I realized I was getting the prior semester so frustrated
Yeah.
because I was so focused on work, 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 and I was
Hmm.
not enjoying myself. After you come out of that theater, what things did you start putting other than that going? What things did you start putting into motion that eventually led you to this trip you organized to go to Pittsburgh? I mean,
Yeah.
how did coming out of a movie theater bleed into that and bleed
Yeah.
in a good way? Like how did that
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
lead into that?
Yeah,
And walk us
so
through it a bit.
okay, so after I saw the documentary, that's when I did a deep dive into the episodes. So I went back to season 1. I went back to the very beginning and watched as many episodes as I could get my hands on Amazon Prime.
Mm,
Um, and I took notes. I have a notebook. This is my all kid things notebook, and this was
wonderful.
my little journal entries from my trip. But I immediately started researching a little bit more about what he did and tried to see it now that I had the information that I had about why he did the things that he did, and the thought behind it. Now I could go back and observe what he did on a practical level and say, oh, okay, I see what he's doing with that. I see what he's doing with the trolley. He's using that as a transitional object, which is a psychological term. He used it as a transitional object to help children transition from the real world to the neighborhood of make believe. So
Yeah.
they knew, oh, this is a change. Here's something familiar that's here every time when we make this change, and it will come back to us. And so I was seeing all these little things. I was making all these like frantic notes on every episode of like, oh, okay, you know, when you're if you're interviewing someone, um, make sure that you don't forget your television neighbors. Like he'd be talking, doing an interview like with Yo-Yo Ma or something. He'd be doing an interview with Yo-Yo Ma, and then he would turn to the camera
Yes.
at some point and say, okay,
No.
friend, and he would bring his friends into the conversation, make sure they didn't feel left out of the
No.
conversation because they were very much part of it for him. Things like this. So I started doing this deep dive, this deep episodic dive of the show itself. Um, and then what led me to the trip was I was doing all this research and probably posting a trillion times about Fred Rogers at that point on social media. I don't know. But I ended up just booking a trip to Pittsburgh because I just wanted to go and see where it all started. I
Mm-hmm.
didn't have any connections in Pittsburgh at all. Just decided I would go. I needed to go find out more about Fred and where this all began.
Did you share it with people, like, as you were pre-planning, like what was
Hmm.
people's feedback about this?
Well, so I'd said I was going to go to Pittsburgh, and most people were like, "Oh, that's so great! Have so much fun! You should go eat here." Um, the
But your
normal
mind is
things people
like,
say. I'm like, I'm not there to like try out the restaurants. No, no, this
yeah.
is a work trip for me. This is a personal work trip. So I had a friend of mine, Corey, reach out to me, and he said, "Hey, you should consider contacting some of the people from the film, and
Mm.
see if they might sit down with you at some point."
And
And I
you had not considered that to that
no,
point.
that seemed insane to me.
Yeah,
Like,
yeah,
what?
yeah.
First of all, I'm sure these people's inboxes are just flooding with things
Yes.
because this
Yeah.
documentary just came out.
Yeah.
Um, Additionally, like they don't know I'm just some stranger. Like, why on earth would they meet with some random girl, from Tennessee? And he was like, he's a producer for podcasts, several podcasts, and he said, Anna, I do this all the time for podcasts when I'm having to book people. He said, you would be amazed at how many people are willing to give you their time if you'll just ask for it.
Mm. So
So,
good.
and then he said, here's the first email address. Here you go. So he like started the research, sent me Max King's email address, who's the biographer who wrote The Good Neighbor, which came out last October.
Yes. Yes, I have it
Um,
back there.
and yeah, it's so good. So I reached out to Max King. I reached out to Hedda Sherapan. I reached out to uh, about 3 other people. Every single one of them wrote me back. Every single one of
Wow.
them emailed me back. I mean, this is a cold, cold email, and I'm saying crazy things like, "I saw the documentary. It was beautiful, and I feel like this is the work that I'm meant to do with my life, and I feel this deep connection with Fred, and I want to come find out more about him." Like it was the weirdest. Oh man. And anyway, they all wrote me back, and I ended up scheduling meetings with all these people, and I got a phone call. I remember getting a phone call from Hedda Sherapan. So Hedda started the show with Fred 50 years ago. This is a lifetime's worth of work. And she was the original, she was the OG of the show. Like she
Hmm.
started it with Fred, and she was one of the people I'd emailed, and she called me, and I told her when I'd booked my flights for it, and she called me and said, "Hey, it's Hedda Sharapan, and I would love to sit down and talk with you. Tell me a little bit more about your story and what you thought about the film." So I did that. Tried not to just sob the whole time, and then she said, "Well, listen, I'm going to be out of town the days that you'd planned to be here. Would you be able? Are those days flexible?" Um, and I was like, "Yep, absolutely they are." So my sister's a flight attendant, so I was able to get just a standby
Oh,
ticket for
wonderful.
free, which was great. So I was like, "Yep, no problem." So I went home that night and changed my flight, and yeah, so I spent time with Max King first, sobbed in his office, his high rise office in the middle of downtown Pittsburgh. He was so kind. He ended up giving me an advance copy of The Good Neighbor. So I had it for about a year
Oh,
before it came
wow.
out. And I mean, no cover design or anything. Like it
Yeah,
was,
yeah, that's
had typos in it and all
prime.
kinds of stuff. And he said, he was so kind. And he said, I get a lot of emails from people like you who have this deep connection with Fred and who would love to continue this work. He said, none of them have ever shown up at my office. He said, so if anybody's going to do it, I'm convinced it'll be you.
Yeah, that shows.
And he said, stay right here. I'm going to run up to my office and I'll bring some. We were in like a conference room, and he brings down 12 of these. And I haven't given most of them out because I'm very embarrassed by all these typos and it's not finished yet. But he said, I think that you're on a journey, and this book could give you some answers for that journey. And so, I devoured the book in like 2 days, and it was beautiful. And um,
What book is this?
The Good Neighbor,
The Good Neighbor. Okay.
the advanced copy of The Good Neighbor. So I went from there to, I walked out onto the street and sat for a few minutes and ended up meeting up with David Newell, who played Mr. McFeely on the show.
Mm-hmm.
Hedda had let him know that I was in town, and he had called me the day before and
So
said,
she made the connection for
she made the
you.
connection for me, and
Wow.
he said, I'd love to go to dinner, and I'll tell you whatever you want to know. Like, I'm happy to share all the stories. And
I
so
love that.
he shows up in downtown Pittsburgh with a tote bag, a Mr. Rogers Neighborhood tote bag full of books and a sweatshirt and a t-shirt. Like, he brought me all this swag from the show.
Yes, that's
And
dude.
he showed up and he said, are you Anna? I said, yes, sir. And he said, well, I'm David. Speedy delivery. And he hands me this bag, and
That's beautiful.
and we
So
proceed to go to dinner, and he takes me all around Pittsburgh and shows me, all these different Fred memorial kind of sites, and
no.
told me all these beautiful stories from his days working on the show. And then the next day I spent literally all day with Hedda, and we drove out to Latrobe, which is Fred's hometown, where he was born. And it's where the Fred Rogers Center is, and the archives and all of that. So I got to read through old scripts and old letters, like fan mail that they had gotten that Fred had like handwritten responses to. I mean, it was the most insane, magical trip ever. And these people were so kind. It makes complete and total sense that they were the people who built this
Uh,
show with him. I mean, they
I
were
just thought
exactly
about
who you
that.
think they are. Yeah. Um, it was incredible.
How
So,
long? How long were you there for?
oh, like 2 days.
So
Yeah,
it was like
I've
a two one to like it's like meeting people basically
back to back.
all the
Yep.
time. So I mean, how long did it take you to digest it all? Or like when
Oh,
did you start like because you're living things and they're happening
yeah.
and just sensational, but like the process of kind of digesting what has just happened
Hmm.
and not to consider them as celebrities, just about the magical essence of, I mean, you're just the strangers, but I
Yeah.
think that's also a myth that we have to let go. This myth of
Yes.
strangers and that,
Yes. People are people.
yeah.
People are people are people are people. And that's what I had to tell myself too. Like, and what was beautiful about that experience was that um, David and Hedda both kind of shared this idea or this sensibility that so much of the focus was on Fred for as long as he was alive. You know, he was the spokesperson and the face of that show, and they were behind the scenes people. Even David, who even though he was on screen, was very much a side character, and
Hmm.
um, but this was their life's work. I mean, Hedda was in 2018. She had been doing this show and working for Fred Rogers or with Fred Rogers Productions in some
Jeez.
capacity for 50 years.
Yeah, it's
And
heavy.
they both, they both said to me and expressed to me how grateful they were that someone wanted to hear their stories,
Yeah.
and there's so much power in being a witness to someone else's story and to giving the space for someone to share. I mean, that's what you've done so beautifully with this whole series, is to give people space to share their stories and their journeys that mean so much to them, and it means something to everyone, whether they were the ones who founded Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood or not. It matters. So it was incredibly important, I think, for all of us.
When I think that when you share a story, or when you basically when you share your heart about
Mm-hmm.
something to someone, I mean, they either, I hate to sound so much into binaries, but they either get it or they don't.
Sure.
But there's something, of course, it's something of essence when they get it, no? And
Mm-hmm.
that's what we maybe call
Yeah, sure.
connection, chemistry,
Yeah.
whatever. Um, because I remember telling people, I like watching Miss Rogers, and they would be like, "Oh yeah, he's so cute," and I'm like,
Mm.
"Oh, you just so don't get it right now."
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
It's not about me being obsessed or
Mm-hmm.
not. It's about there was something intrinsically revolutionary going on in
Mm-hmm.
each and every one of his, whether it be during his show, whether it be in interviews.
Yep.
I mean, I've seen that Charlie Rose interviews so many times.
Oh.
And then and also the people that thought that he was a character, that
Mm-hmm.
the
Mm-hmm.
experience that they ended up having. I remember, and I don't know if it's in the book A Good Neighbor, but it was one of the books that they share of this guy that encounters him in an elevator, and
Mm-hmm.
he's sharing about his grandfather passing or something like that, and Fred is he could clearly tell that he was on his way somewhere,
Mm-hmm.
and then he just stopped, and then he sat down with this quote unquote stranger,
Yeah.
and he started sharing about his own relationship with his grandparents.
Mm.
And I think that even and I think that's the relevance that both the documentary and then eventually the movie that came out
Mm-hmm.
last year play into a time like this, and it play into also in this time of pandemia, like when we are faced with, do we really want to continue how we were
Right.
before?
Right.
And all this push to go back to normal. What is normal? And
Right.
because normal seems quite ineffective,
Yeah.
oppressive, and if there's something that Fred stood for, he was stood for being very candid and open about things. Speaking
Mm-hmm.
about war,
Yes.
speaking about assassination when back in the
Yes.
Robert Kennedy
Yes.
got murdered,
Yes.
and MLK, divorce, all these things
Mm-hmm.
that contextually put 60s, 70s
Yeah.
were not probably. I mean, I remember watching Different Strokes, and Different
Yeah.
Strokes was huge. Having this,
Yeah.
talking about racism and stuff, and
Mm-hmm.
Rogers was doing it. Now it's 2020.
Yeah.
A lot has happened during these last 6 months, and like I mentioned last year, the movie was put out,
Mm-hmm.
and I don't think anyone really foresaw what the next 9, 10 months were going to be
Mm-hmm.
like ahead. What do you think? Tuning into the philosophy, the pedagogy, the reality, or the realm that Fred Rogers was tapping into, comments into this, into this time that we're living in. What,
Mm-hmm.
it's a bit of a big, broad question, and I have no shame for asking it,
No, it's
because
great.
I don't have the, and I'm not the one who has to answer it.
Mm.
But I mean, with all seriousness, what what commentary
Mm.
does that, and I want to say that pedagogical realm, because I think he was a teacher,
Mhm.
um, in all its merits, talks about now, like this this 2020, the world as it is now,
Mhm.
now in a what, 2 3 months, 2 months prior to an election that is so cathartic, and it's emblematic to many things that are going on
Yeah.
here and in the world. What do you think the commentary is? I'm not asking you to talk for Mr. Rogers, but to talk from your
Mm.
experience of diving into what does it do to you,
Mm.
and how do you, this might touch a little bit as to the last question I usually ask, but what is your, what, how do you, how do you navigate these times, and how does having that background of Fred and how it's impacted you, how does you, how does that prepare
Mm.
you to living in these times, and how does it help you, how does it problematize?
Right. Yeah, I mean, Fred's one of Fred's, classic songs was um, It's You I Like, which is the shirt that I have on. Um, it's you I like, every part of you. Um, oh, I didn't mean to show it, but sorry, I just adjusted myself.
Well, you
Uh,
can show it if you
oh
want,
yeah,
so
sure.
people can
Here,
see it.
I got this adorable like line drawing shirt. It's You I Like, and it's Fred and Daniel Tiger.
Daniel the Tiger, yeah.
Yeah. Um, I think Fred had this sort of unwavering sensibility of acceptance, of a deep acceptance of others, regardless of their thoughts or feelings about things, or beliefs, or politics, or whatever. He also stayed kind of out of those conversations in general, in the adult realm. Um, so I don't know what he would say now, but I do think that there's something to be said about finding finding the humanity in other people wherever and however you can find it, which is which is made particularly difficult with the way that we have a lot of discourse right now,
Mm,
primarily through social media. It's all online, and so much of it is very reactive, I think, and um, is very difficult to find the humanity in other people, especially when you are physically distanced from humans,
no.
and all that exists is sort of their virtual presence. But I think Mr. Rogers particularly calls us, in his whole way of things, calls us to find the humanity in people. That's what he did for adults. He displayed the humanity of children to adults. It's why he did everything that he did the way that he did it. He talked about difficult things because kids are human living in this same world that we are, and they deserve to know what's going on in a way that's appropriate and, makes sense for them. But he modeled for us what it meant to honor the humanity of other people, um, in a way that was respectful and kind and gentle. And I think the world, while I do think, and I'm learning this. I'm learning the value of anger, and the how much of a force it can be for good,
Mm-hmm.
which is something I've struggled with a lot. Just the whole concept of anger is really is really difficult for me to wrap my head around. I don't know how to deal with anger very well. I hold things in, and then it sort of explodes, like we were
Yeah.
talking about earlier. Um, but I think Fred gives us ways to process big things like that in ways that are healthy and helpful for others. I mean, Fred channeled his anger about how the world treats children by creating this beautiful,
Yeah.
gentle, sweet, but also very provocative and thoughtful show.
Yeah.
And it wasn't necessarily what it appeared to be, but it did everything that he wanted to do, I think, in a lot of ways. So I think that's a lesson too, maybe, is find where your anger lies and then find something beautiful to create out of that. Um, that's not destructive, but rather that is generative, that is life giving. Yeah, that's not a commentary on any sort of violence. That's a commentary of that's how I see Fred's work. I've seen um, I've seen him talk about, the interviews where he gets so angry and upset that nobody seems to be talking to the kids about these big things that are happening in the
Yeah.
world.
Yeah.
And you can see that. You can see it. You can see it boiling
Yes.
over. You can see the anger and hear the anger in his voice. Um, and
Indignation.
yeah, and then he went and created something beautiful from it. And I think maybe that's the call to all of us too, find the humanity and find where your anger lies, your very just and righteous anger, and make something of it.
Yeah, and I think it's there there is the challenge of wanting to, which is a which I think, as a Puerto Rican living in my diaspora here in the United States, living away from my country, I think that's
Mm-hmm.
something I observe here, is that there is a tendency to gloss over things.
Yes.
That's clearly demonstrated with the whole issue, with racism.
Yes.
The ability, I think something that this country, in general terms, has mastered is the art of pretending.
Mm-hmm.
The art of pretending it's all okay. The art of pretending that the democracy is at its best. The art of
Right.
pretending that we're going to go to that country to help it. The art of pretending
Right.
many things. But it's
Right.
like having a backed up plumbing job in your house. At some
Yes.
point, all
It's
the
gonna blow.
shit's gonna blow
Yeah.
out,
Right.
and it's gonna be really hard to avoid that. There's shit
Right.
all around you and
Right.
smells and all navigating in it. So I think that something I value about Fred is that he was not trying to gloss over things.
Mm-mm.
He
Mm-mm.
was very. I compare him somewhat to MLK in the sense that,
Mm.
MLK was constantly accused that he was stirring up the peace, and he would just he kind of
Mhm.
paraphrase like, what
Yeah.
peace, what
Right.
peace,
Right.
because the absence of conflict does not
It's not
equate to
peace.
peace, and is that
Yes.
presence of social justice, that presence of
Yes.
justice, is then in turn, then we can talk
Yes.
somewhat about a peace. So being conscious that, yeah, things are not as they should be,
Yeah.
pretending like they are is a huge problem. It talks
Yes.
about, it makes you complicit to
Yes.
that. So having a space
Mm.
where those conversations can happen, I think
Yes.
that's something he did, and he did quite beautifully. And our call, I think, is to be able to take, and that's where the creative space comes in.
Yes.
How do you take this climate, and how do you take it without glossing over,
Yeah.
without pretending it's not happening,
Yeah.
without making, oh, I'm going to make a Barney, I'm going to make another dinosaur? No, no.
Right.
How do you accept it's happening, and fight it
Yes.
militantly, prophetically,
Yeah.
but at the same time, how do you also take time to, as your shirt says, listen to kids, to listen
Mm-hmm.
to one another, and how does that look? And I have two more questions before we close.
Sure.
And one is in line of your shirt,
Mm-hmm.
and very simple message, just three words,
3 words.
but what has that done for you? That where does that in particular
Mm.
come from, that you decide to, I want to, permanently stamp it on this, and I want to, it's a statement, and
Yeah.
is it a very provocative statement? So tell us a bit where that kind of was birthed, and how has that shaped your life in a way?
Yeah. Well, so I think again, I've learned a lot about truly considering children when I'm creating something, when I'm speaking, when I'm teaching. And I consider myself, my sort of self-given title is a children's advocate, and I use that term um, very intentionally. And what I mean by that is just we have a world that is not set up in a way that tells me that we see children as people. I think overall, at least traditionally, we have seen children as property. We have seen children as not quite there yet. There's always a
Mm,
yet, to childhood.
the
And
future.
yeah, yes. And we love to say that children are our future, which um, obviously is true. Logistically speaking, yes, that's true. What is missed in that statement is they're here now, though. Like there are people now. They are here and have things to say and things to give to the world. And we have so much to learn from them now. And don't miss that part. Don't relegate them to the future. Don't relegate their value to the future. They have great amount of value now. And I think when we listen, not just to, I guess, listen to kids for me isn't just about spoken words. It's
Hmm.
about behavior. It's about social and emotional development. It's about actually being present to the life of a child so that you not only hear their words more clearly and hear what they're trying to communicate as they're developing their language, but you also hear what is behind, the tantrums or the failed classes or the you start to recognize, like, oh, these are human beings trying to navigate this existence on this planet. They are brand new to this planet. That is scary. That is incredibly scary. This place is huge. It's also really fun and exciting, but it can be incredibly overwhelming and
Yeah.
scary. Um, and so there are all these opportunities for us to listen, for us to tune into the lives of the children around us, to hear what's actually being communicated and what's actually being said. And I was going to say one more thing about that, and I don't remember exactly what I was going to say, but I think that's does that answer the question?
No, we're missing that one thing.
I'm sure it will come to me as soon
It
as we stop recording.
it'll if it comes, it comes. If it not, it
Yeah,
wasn't
it's
meant to
okay.
be.
Yeah.
No, like I like, and I think I on our previous interactions, back and forth. I think you mentioned that, and that really resonated to me.
Yeah.
How you put that into words, like they are whole people now.
Yeah.
They're not
Yep.
on a, they're not, it's not like some purgatory. They're waiting to
Yes.
be redeemed or waiting to be identified. And it speaks about language and the importance of language and the importance
Yes.
of language we use, because
Yes.
language makes us too. We don't make language so much as language makes us. I remember
Mm,
taking linguistics
that's
in my
great.
pedagogical degree, and I would always be so tangled up in that philosophy of language and all that kind of class. I'm like, what do you
Yeah.
mean?
Yeah.
But it makes so much sense that we
Mm-hmm.
we are made by what we
Mm-hmm.
state, and even more when it becomes normal. Now you try to problematize something
Mm-hmm.
that is normal, or something that is American pie, is whatever, like something that is just like it's
Right.
autochthonous, it's a statement, it's stated as fact,
Yep.
like gravity.
Yep.
But things need to be, some things desperately need to be problematized. Some things
Yeah.
desperately need to. Sorry for the status quo. It's
Yeah.
overrated.
Yeah.
It's so overrated.
Yeah.
And children were property. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
they didn't die. I remember going into Bible studies, and going into that realm. When women and children were not accounted for.
Yeah.
So we have a little bit of that even still now.
Absolutely. I mean, even in I think the traditional ways that we parent or caregive or deal with children, it's often this demand for compliance. It's a control of another individual, and as much as that may relieve tension in the short term for everyone who's uncomfortable, it may not actually do a whole lot
No.
of good. I don't believe that it does, and so yeah, I think in that way we still do seem to see children as these entities that belong to us as property that we have to manage. We are
Yeah.
property managers, rather than just coexisting with children and
Yeah.
just sort of helping them and guiding them along the way as they discover who they are and how to exist in the world.
And the last thing I want to throw out there and provoke a bit before I ask you the last question and we wrap up this fun
Yeah.
conversation. Um, we stamp this on kids even before they're born. These gender reveal parties, which I am
Mhm.
so allergic to. I'm like, what
Yeah.
is? I wish to. The other day I saw this one. I think it was in the Emirate part, and it was this grand thing. I don't know if it was a prince
Mm.
or a princess, but they made the reveal project into these buildings,
Oh,
these
wow.
skyscrapers, and I was like, man, how huge of a statement would it be if that couple would have been like, it's a human.
Yep.
It's a human,
Yep.
and who the hell cares if it's going to be a boy or girl?
Right.
Why do we put this? It's almost like
Yeah.
this pre-established, and then again, and then that also adds all these things that we put them on this little. It's like we have these two little railways, and we put
Yeah.
the blue one and the pink one.
Yeah.
And I mean, there's so much that we need to just get rid of. It's
Yeah.
not useful.
Yep.
It's
It's
not
really not.
useful.
It's really not.
I like to close off with this question about the utopias. Utopia as the utopia as this realm of the imaginary space of that
Hmm.
reference point. And and Eduardo Galeano, who's this Chilean, I believe, author, he shares a story. It's not a story original to him, but I think it's a classroom setting, and they're talking about the horizon and the utopia is sitting there, and we're walking towards it. We take 5 steps, and then it takes 5 steps forward. We take 10 steps, and it takes 10 steps forward. So it just seems like this
Mm.
unattainable
Yeah.
journey. So it's like, what is then the purpose
Mm.
of the utopia that we just cannot attain and grasp and hold? So you move forward. So you keep on moving forward. So I ask you, Anna, what for you are those utopias that
Mm.
allow you to keep on moving forward in times like this? In times
Yeah.
like this that it seems so shitty and so fucked up. That where where do you where do you find that inspiration that and the
Yeah.
horizon that allows you to keep moving on? What are your utopias?
Hmm. Well, I mean, as far as just inspiration, obviously, Fred and all the work he did, and constantly remembering, this is less forward and more backward, but remembering that sense of purpose and just kind of keeping that in front of me at all times. And then on like I'll give you like a micro example of a utopia for me. So I have this dream of building a so I have a company called Kidco, which is the company under which I made the you're this way the shirt that you're wearing. And my dream is for Kidco to have a physical space and maybe multiple physical spaces, a physical space that is fully accessible to children. So the doors aren't too heavy to open from the outside. There are, noise canceling headphones and fidgets as soon as you walk in. If you're on sensory overload, there are lots of tactile things all around. The countertops are at a height where children can interact with whoever's behind the counter, just like their parents can or their caregivers. Um, the toilets are accessible to them. The sinks are accessible to them. I mean, if you start to notice the ways that the world is not accessible to children, you'll see it everywhere and it'll drive you crazy. But um, obviously, for safety reasons, some things can't be accessible. But
Yeah.
anyway, but I have this dream and this vision of creating this physical space that is built specifically for children. Um, it would sort of act as like and there would be like multiple spaces in this physical building, like a music laboratory or an art space or a coding, lab or something. All these places where kids can explore different things and different activities, different interests, so it would be like this place they could go after school and be safe and seen and welcomed. And then also sort of this weird like museum-ish, like kid museum space. I don't know how you would describe it, but that like a physical building, a physical space that is built and like architected with children on a board of designers, right? Like
Mm,
kids inform how it's designed. Not only literally they're speaking into it, but also just the way that everything is built is made so that they can interact with the space fully as individuals as safely as possible. And that I wish that existed, and it does in some forms, but it's not. They're usually like kid specific spaces, meaning they're only for kids, and parents come and just like stand around. I want this to
mm,
be a place where we exist communally,
yeah.
where adults learn to coexist with children. Um, yeah, in a space that's built for everyone to participate and belong. That's what I want.
That's sensational on a parallel level, how a thing should be.
Yeah.
That's beautiful. That's
Thank you.
beautiful. I'm kind of reminded of that scene in the documentary when Fred Rogers is exposing before to get the funding, and
Yeah.
this hard ass guy just tenders up and
Yeah.
just says, that's just great.
Yeah. That's
Had
all he
my
could say.
encounter.
That's great. I guess you got your money.
That's yeah,
Yeah.
that's I am experiencing humanity right now, and I think
Mm,
that's wonderful. I think that's
thank
a
you.
great utopia to have, not as an unattainable thing, but definitely as a reference point
Yeah.
that can be very much attained to, and very
Mm,
much so urgently and dramatically necessary
yeah.
to have that.
Mm.
Ana, gracias, thank you. This has been a treat.
Yes, same. I've loved this so much. Sorry we went way over
No, no,
time.
no. This is the framing. We didn't go over.
Yeah.
There's no
Mm,
way over unless I had consented to the other brand. We consented to make
yeah.
it like this, so we
Yep.
went as it should have been. So, thank you so much.
Yeah.
I definitely will remain in touch with you
Yes, please do.
and mutually see what ventures we're mutually getting
Yeah.
into, what trouble we're getting into for
Yes.
the well-being of
Good trouble.
humanity. Claro
Mm-hmm.
que sí. So, and
Yes.
also everyone who tuned in or everyone who might be tuning in a recorded fashion, hello to you. I hope you get something out of this, and I have good faith that you will. So I always like to close off with these words, and they are the closing words of a famous Puerto Rican astrologer who actually has a documentary on Netflix called Mucho Mucho Amor,
Mm,
and it's about his life. I highly suggest you to watch it. It's a very
okay.
interesting, fascinating story about this person who every time he would close his segments, and he would give all his readings about all the different astrological signs and stuff. He would close off with this. Espero que tenga mucha paz. I hope you have plenty of peace. But overall things, pero sobre todo mucho, mucho amor.
Mm,
Much, much love.
much, much
So
love. Yeah.
we need a lot of that. So thank you, everyone. Gracias, Ana.
Thank you. Thank you.
Don't disconnect.
Okay.
And until next time, see you, everyone, tomorrow. Be in peace.
Bye.